Good afternoon and welcome. We gather here together today for the State Memorial Service in celebration of the life of Mr. Steele Hall. My name is Rex Jory, and for 25 years I was a political journalist with the News and the Advertiser, a period which largely coincided with Steele's political career. It is my honour and privilege to facilitate today's memorial service for Steele. Before I start, we all know the protocols about telephones, so if you could please silence your phones so that we don't interrupt the service. I know it would take me 10 minutes to do that, but I'm not good at electronics. On behalf of Joan Hall, the family would like to thank the Premier of South Australia, the Honourable Peter Malinauskas, for hosting the State Memorial Service, and for His Excellency the Governor, dignitaries, family, friends and colleagues for joining us today. There are so many familiar faces in the audience. We're here to acknowledge and honour Steele's life, career and contribution to South Australia over a career built on many levels. Steele was certainly one of South Australia's most significant and influential political figures of the second half of the last century. He almost single-handedly changed the political landscape when, as Premier, he redrew the electoral boundaries in the House of Assembly and ended a pro-Liberal gerrymander. He had a unique parliamentary career which spanned more than 33 years. He not only served as South Australia's 36th Premier from 1968, he is also the only Australian Premier to serve as a member of three legislatures: the South Australian House of Assembly from 1959 to 1974, the Federal Senate between 1974 and 1977, and finally as the long-standing member for Boothby in the Federal House of Representatives between 1981 and 1996. As he relinquished Boothby in 1996, I used to chide Steele to run as an independent in the Legislative Council and sit in all four seats, but he was tempted perhaps, but fortunately he resisted. Throughout his political life, which embodied political courage and personal integrity, he continuously fought for what he recognised as the best interests of South Australia. I first met Steele when he was Premier in 1969. He was the 36th South Australian Premier and the first to occupy what has become the traditional Premier's office in the State Administration Building. That corner office is now occupied by the 47th Premier of South Australia, the Honourable Peter Malinauskas. I invite Mr. Malinauskas to say a few words.
Well, thank you, Rex, for the introduction, and I feel somewhat humbled, if not overwhelmed, to be able to speak at a function such as this today. Can I acknowledge Brigadier Tim Hanna AM, representing the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia, to Her Excellency Frances Adamson AC, Governor of South Australia, the broad sweep of parliamentary colleagues here this afternoon, and most importantly, of course, the family of the late Steele Hall. I, of course, would like to acknowledge that we do get together here on the lands of the Kaurna people. But my word, it is right and fitting that we celebrate the life of Steele Hall here in the Adelaide Festival Centre, a house of progress that Steele Hall built. It is all but impossible to imagine Adelaide without this iconic building at its heart. But more than just being the heartbeat of South Australian culture, this centre serves as a metaphor for Steele Hall's public service. For it is true that for the Adelaide Festival Centre to be built on this location would require controversy to be overcome through the demonstration of two key characteristics: conviction and courage. The two key characteristics that would define one of the most substantial figures South Australian politics will ever know. On any objective analysis of the Hall government's achievements, it is extraordinary that Hall was Premier for only 776 days, barely 2 years and change. Steele Hall's leadership facilitated so many significant achievements for our state, to the development of important industries such as the gas industry, the improvement of Aboriginal rights before others had the courage to pursue such change, in legislating access to safe abortion services, in rolling out the fluoridation of Adelaide's water supply. The longevity of the government may have been modest, but the momentum for the state was real. It is especially impressive because it would have been easy for Hall to have chosen to be a cautious Premier, even timid, given that he was leading a minority government in the aftermath of a nail-bitingly close election that had taken several agonising weeks to resolve. The 1968 election, of course, was between a 41-year-old Don Dunstan and a 39-year-old Steele Hall. Two energetic, thoughtful, articulate leaders whose relative youth spoke to the optimism of the age. In an election that was dubbed the Battle of the Matinee Idols, one might imagine that when the commentariat of the time were previewing any televised leaders' debate, they may have set the respective pass marks a little higher than just being able to deliver coherent sentences or the avoidance of any rage-fuelled meltdown. Following the hard-fought battle and close victory, Steele Hall chose not to take any easy options, particularly if it was at the expense of doing what was right. And he proved more than willing to expend whatever political capital he had in the pursuit of necessary and positive change for the South Australian people. The words that have recurred so often in recent reflections of Premier Hall say much about the measure of the man: conviction and courage. We saw that courage in his legislation to address the state's glaring electoral malapportionment, the playmander, which had so benefited his own party. A change which significantly levelled the electoral playing field for our state, enabling a permanent, legitimate contest of ideas. We saw that conviction when he cancelled a proposed dam at Chowilla when faced with the inarguable environmental and economic evidence against it, despite knowing that doing so would lose the support of the independent MP on whom his minority government would survive. We saw that courage as he founded a new political body, the Liberal Movement, to promote the principles he feared were being eroded. We saw that conviction when he chose to back the Dunstan government in expanding the democratic franchise of the state's upper house, bringing it closer to the representative ideal of one vote, one value. We saw his courage in pursuing a successful second act as a federal politician, ultimately becoming the only Australian in our federation to have ever served in 3 different legislatures. We saw his conviction in calling out the blocking of the supply bills against the Whitlam government in 1975. And in 1988, we saw his courage in crossing the floor in the federal parliament in opposing a proposal to make race a determinant in migrant intake, a proposition Hall found both personally repugnant and dangerously corrosive to Australian society. These are only a few milestones marking a journey guided by deeply held principles. After Hall retired as the member for Boothby ahead of the 1996 election, a journalist asked him to sum up his time in politics, and he replied, "I do not have a record which is wimpish or weak." Today, particularly in the modern context, we can safely say that is a gross understatement indeed. I offer my deepest condolences to Joan and to Steele and Joan's children and grandchildren, and to everyone whose lives have been touched by Steele Hall. Today, we bid farewell to a man whose life and legacy should serve as an example to leaders across our great land. A life led with conviction and extraordinary courage. A life to whom all South Australians owe an enduring thanks. May Steele Hall rest in peace.
Thank you, Premier. In 1977, Steele was the Liberal candidate in the federal Labor-held seat of Hawker. He set up a campaign office in a disused service station in Anzac Highway, and one afternoon a young man wandered in and asked if he could help in Steele's campaign. Steele didn't win Hawker, but the young man continued to work for the Liberal Party and was a key ministerial advisor in the Tonkin Liberal government from 1979. He eventually left Adelaide for London, where he set up a public relations company, and the young man became an advisor to British Prime Ministers and American presidential candidates. He was knighted for his services to British politics. I would now invite Sir Linton Crosby to share a eulogy.
Thanks, Rex. Today I speak as a Liberal Party supporter and friend of Steele Hall's across 5 decades. Before I make some remarks about Steele, I do, on Joan's behalf, want to thank all of you and many beyond this building who have given her and the family great support since Steele's passing, and in particular to acknowledge Heidi Black and Graham Ingerson for the support they have given Joan. Upon his passing, the Balaclava Plains producer mourned the loss of our man of steel on its front page. That said it all. A man from the plains, a farmer, a politician. Above all, a man of integrity and strength, plain speaking, plain values. A Liberal but never a woke warrior. A dogged egalitarian who refused the title honourable when he achieved high office. Steele hated fuss, and he's probably looking down on us right now, murmuring about this state funeral, despite deserving it. He grew up on the land at Owen. Plenty of time to reflect on life whilst tending sheep and driving the tractor. And the hot, dry summers of the plains to Adelaide's north made him truly value water. Water was to feature in his maiden speech and become the trigger for the end of his term as Premier. One online commentator, in response to his passing, said with affection, "Tin shed was one of the good ones." Well, this tin shed was no flimsy lean-to that would buckle in even a mild wind. This Steele Hall was upright and strong, could withstand ferocious political storms, and would not buckle. Many years and several generations have passed since Steele was Premier and party leader. Given this passage of time, it would be easy to forget just how significant the changes he drove were, and how much opposition there was to some. It was a febrile and ferocious time politically, and the issues he championed were often big ones that were society shaping, as we've already heard. Steele believed in things and had the courage to do what he knew to be right, putting principle before party or self, as Premier Malinauskas reminds us. In his maiden speech in July 1959, his first maiden speech, Steele touched on three things which set the scene for his political life. The first was his approach to politics. "I do not doubt that I will have differences with members opposite," he said, "but on all occasions I will try to keep those differences on an ideological level." And he did, although it wasn't just with members opposite that he differed on points of principle. In July 1974 in the Senate, in the second of his record-breaking three maiden speeches, he said, "I am an anti-Labor politician. However, I fear that too many people who call themselves Liberals have lost any idea of what they stand for and have no central core of ideology." A second focus in his first maiden speech was water. Steele displayed his practical nature with an intricate explanation on how to line water pipes with cement to protect this scarce resource, a subject to which he devoted almost 800 words. The third was an observation about the role of government. "There is a limit to what government can do for people," Steele said. "It cannot minister to them at every turn of their lives from the cradle to the grave, and it is undesirable that it should do so, or we would live in nothing but a vast commune." You know, it's hard to pinpoint when you first have an interest in something like politics. I certainly cannot point to a defining moment for me. I do recall what might be loosely described as my first political act, and Steele was at its core. It was 1970. After losing the support of Tom Stott, the Speaker who held the balance of power, Steele went to an election over water security, as you have heard. Stott wanted a dam to be built at Chowilla in his electorate. For Steele, the facts, which were always important to him, pointed to a better location than an obvious pork barrel. Water was central to the campaign. The Liberal and Country League produced thousands of stickers in the shape of Steele's head as a black silhouette with his distinctive long sideburns against a neon orange background, and the words, "We want more water," slap bang in the middle of Steele Hall's face. It was my first political sticker. I only had one, and I placed it where only a teenager would think that a sticker with the words "We want more water" should go, on the toilet cistern. It was a defiant political act, and it stayed in that spot for years. Despite my mum's best efforts to remove it, Mr. Hall's head would not budge, a bit like Steele himself. I first met Steele, as Rex has said, in 1997. He was back in the Liberal Party after forming the Liberal movement and was candidate for the federal seat of Hawker. My Kadina friend Peter Black and I were active young Liberals. We arrived at Steele's campaign office in a disused service station on Anzac Highway to volunteer for someone who to us, as young people, was charismatic and motivating. There was Steele, along with Joan, being the practical man he was, fixing signs to posts for distribution across Hawker. He welcomed us with a smile, shook our hands, and then said, "Okay, boys, let's get on with it." It was the beginning of a lifelong association, starting with politics and ending in friendship. Steele was always a strong supporter of the Young Liberals. He became a life member. It was an honour he held high. In 1982, as a Young Liberal president, I ran as the Liberal candidate for Norwood with strong support from Joan and Steele. I gave it everything, and I managed to turn a marginal Labor seat into a safe Labor seat. Whenever Dawn and I ran for the Liberal Party office, Steele and Joan were there to provide wise counsel and support, as they did to so many. Steele became the member for Boothby in 1981. The selection meeting was so intense and the contest so tight that the chairman, who was no fan of Steele's, initially announced the wrong winner. But Steele endured by one vote, and the runner-up, Alexander Downer, had to wait. In 1997, I became the Liberal Party Federal Director. That still chose to retire from politics in 1996 makes me grateful. The idea of me, as a party official, having to cope with Steele is something I would have dreaded. He was a principled maverick. He crossed the floor. He asked difficult questions. Party officials like to control things. They don't always welcome people like Steele causing them grief. As families, we holidayed together, enjoyed family weddings and celebrated birthdays, where Steele invariably ended up tending the barbecue. Onlookers would be surprised to see a political icon with tongs in one hand and a beer in the other. As party members, we fought battles alongside each other. Steele could turn his talents to many things. He built a big, sturdy table around which many of us would sit and plot those political battles over the years. He was proud of that table. It was made from a section of Bowling Alley Lane. Steele said he had got that laminated lump at a good price. It was so heavy, it was barely movable. An often immovable man with an equally immovable table. For someone who in political life was often in the limelight, Steele could be a reserved and contemplative figure. When my parents died, he was there at their funerals, sitting alone at the back of the Muta Uniting Church, a loyal friend, paying his respects, queuing quietly to shake my hand, pass on his condolences, and then driving himself back to Adelaide, a kind, elderly gent far removed from the political turmoil of earlier times. Steele Hall was persuasive and determined. Martin Cameron tells the story of when Martin's Senate term was coming to an end in 1971. He had promised his wife Barbara that there would be no more politics. It was time to return to the farm. Imagine Martin's surprise when, in Millicent to collect the mail, he spied a story in the Tiser announcing he was running for the Legislative Council. Arriving home, he hid the paper from Barbara and rang Steele to ask what was going on. Steele, without any apology, proclaimed that he knew Martin didn't want to run, so he thought it would best he announce it on Martin's behalf. Martin put Barbara, who could be pretty forthright herself, on the phone. A few minutes later, after hearing Steele out, Barbara turned to Martin and said, "Well, you better run." And so Martin did, serving in the Legislative Council for the next 29 years. Thanks to Steele, the farm just had to wait. Steele drove change, often against considerable opposition, despite the infallible logic of what he sought when we consider it today. Steele Hall, a man of courage, integrity and sincerity, a good and loyal friend. Dawn and I, our family, and the wider Liberal Party family fondly remember his son, the late Michael Hall, and extend to you, Joan, Mary, Kathy, Jane, Alexia and Ben, our thanks for sharing Steele with us and offer you our love, sympathy and support. Steele Hall, a man from the plains who made a difference.
You've got to love those sideburns, don't you? As Joan would attest, Steele had no great interest in sport or the arts, but he was a formidable snooker player. One night in Parliament House, after he had succeeded Sir Thomas as Liberal leader, he played a game of snooker with Sir Thomas. When they finished, Playford handed Steele his personal cue. "This is yours, laddie," he said. It was a symbolic moment, the old bull handing the baton to the young bull. I'm not quite sure where the queue is now, but perhaps, Mr Premier, you could liaise with Joan and have the queue displayed discreetly in Parliament House as a memento of another era of South Australian politics. As a snooker player, Steele was not a great drinker. But as Premier, he once went to London with the head of the Premier's Department, John White. Steele fell into bad company and somehow returned to his hotel about 4 o'clock in the morning. John found him unconscious and fully clothed at 7 o'clock, and he was due to have an audience with the Queen at 10. John dragged Steele through the shower, got him dressed, and they drove to Buckingham Palace. Steele, badly hungover, explained to Her Majesty that he was the victim of British hospitality. The Queen shrieked with laughter, pulled whatever the Queen pulls and ordered black coffee, and the pair hit it off. Another man who occasionally led Steele astray was publican and businessman Peter Hurley. Peter and his wife Jenny were good friends of the Halls, and as AHA President, Peter was a great help to Joan in her role as Minister of Tourism. I would now like to invite Mr Peter Hurley to the lectern to share his reflections.
Thank you, Rex. Like the Premier, I too am at least honoured and even overwhelmed to be asked to pay my respects to my good friend Steele Hall. I moved to Adelaide in May of 1968, just 1 month after our youngest ever Premier, Steele Hall, came to office. He was the first Liberal leader born in the 20th century. His LCL predecessor, Sir Thomas Playford, had served in Gallipoli. I first met Mr Hall soon after purchasing the Belair Hotel in 1983. It was a Blackwood Rotarian meeting, and they were honoured to have the local federal member as their speaker. As Aussie males do when they club together, everybody gets a nickname. And as referred to by Linton, unsurprisingly, the Blackwood Rotarians' very Aussie nickname for Steele Hall was Tin Shed. Now, I certainly didn't use his nickname, but Mr Hall immediately insisted that he was Steele. He was a Christian name bloke. Some years later, Joan became Tourism Minister in John Olsen's government. I would have been derelict in my duty as Australian Hotels Association State and National President if I failed to network the Halls into our friendship group, and so commenced an enduring personal friendship with the remarkable Steele Hall. Now, whether it was an official or a social dinner, I was one of those devious pests who got to the table first and shuffled the table place cards to ensure that I was seated next to Steele. I'd previously been seated beside too many boring people, but it was logistically challenging because we were both stone deaf in one ear and hard of hearing in the other. So I had to ensure that the two least deaf ears were side by side. He was my walking, talking, truth-telling, misinformation-free, absolutely accurate and uncensored modern political history encyclopedia. In the vernacular of rural Australia, I was getting my political history straight from the horse's mouth. And until his health declined a few years ago, his memory and clarity of mind was simply remarkable. On some occasions, it was graphic details about compromise amendment deals with Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. We need to remember that Steele had the balance of power in the Senate when Whitlam was PM. Next time, it may have been a conversation about his close friendship with the nation's first Indigenous MP, Senator Neville Bonner. Steele made no attempt to conceal his affection and respect for Senator Bonner. Whenever Neville Bonner came to Adelaide, be it for business or pleasure, he certainly didn't stay at the Adelaide Hilton. He stayed at the Hall family home. Steele was far too modest to say it, but I'm of no doubt that he mentored Senator Bonner in the ways our democracy worked. I recall other long chats about his regret that the MATS plan, that it didn't happen. It was his most serious political regret. He'd amassed a massive amount of land and it was eventually voted out. But I have no doubt if the MATS plan had happened, the current north-south corridor tunnel would not be needed and my company would still be selling schooners at the Tonsley Hotel. It may well be that Treasurer Mulligan and Minister Koutsantonis's life would be somewhat simpler now if the MATS plan had transpired. There were numerous other stories of our political history told when we broke bread together, but they don't befit being repeated at a state funeral in the presence of the King's representative. The Premier tabled all the significant, prolific legislative reforms of that era, but being 20 years of age at the time, the Hall government reform that most impressed me was the lowering of the legal drinking age from 21 to 18. As Australia was constricting and sending young men to war in Vietnam at that time, it seemed overdue that they should be able to legally have a farewell beer with their mates. Our wonderful nation would be an even better place if more of the political class had the integrity, the courage, the selflessness of Raymond Steele Hall. It's been a very formal occasion, but I think you should feel free to applaud this extraordinary life.
Thank you, Peter. A wise man once told me that if you become emotional at a funeral, you should wiggle your toes. It somehow eases, that's it, I can see people doing it now. It somehow eases the stress. How funny. Douglas Gautier, we may have a new record for Festival Centre in simultaneous toe wiggling. But we now reach a toe wiggling moment. I would like to share with you a few words from Steele and Joan's daughter, Alexia. Every young girl thinks their father is a hero. But it wasn't until I grew up that I realised my father truly was a hero. I have vivid memories from when I was very young, maybe younger than 5. One such memory is from a day Mum and Dad took Ben and I on Popeye. We were cruising and another child fell into the water. Without a moment's hesitation, my dad heard the splash and instantly jumped in and rescued the girl. My dad's heroism wasn't just about dramatic rescues. He had a profound sense of compassion and would help people through their toughest times. We had a gardener who faced many difficulties in life. With little money and no car, he struggled to get by. Seeing this, Dad bought him a car, enabling him to work and improve his situation. At our first house, there was a man living in a car parked out the front. Dad approached him, learned about his hardships, and ended up giving him some financial support. The man left our street soon afterwards, and I hope Dad's help made a difference in his life. One day I had a concert at my school just up the road from our house. As Dad and I were driving there, we saw a man who looked homeless and dishevelled, carrying all his belongings. Dad felt compelled to stop and check him out, despite my concerns about the potential danger. Dad said, "As a man, what do you expect me to do? It is my responsibility to check on him." He stopped the car and approached the man, and they had some heated conversation. And though Dad didn't say much afterwards, I was struck by his bravery. I remember Dad as a man who always helped out, especially when no one else would. But one particular incident highlighted his heroics in a different way. One Saturday morning, Dad, my brother and I found ourselves locked inside the Advertiser building. He had followed a staff member in with the intention of buying some photos, but soon found ourselves alone and locked in. This was before mobile phones, and after waiting over an hour, Dad finally got us out by talking to another passing staff member. A few days later, we even read about it in the Advertiser. It's now time to say goodbye to you, Steele Hall. Rest in peace, Dad. May you remember it all. I think Alex's words reveal a different side to Steele Hall. I know what it's like to be locked in the Advertiser too. When I was writing politics for the news, I rang Steele as Premier and Opposition Leader every morning around 7 o'clock. Sometimes a small voice would answer the phone. "Hello?" Then, without putting the receiver down, the little voice would scream, "Dad, it's the man from the news." I have pretty dodgy hearing, and I'm sure those early morning calls have something to do with that. Our next speaker is that little voice. Steele's eldest child, Mary Rose, and with her his youngest, Ben Hall, who has flown in from London to be with us this afternoon. I would now like to invite Mary and Ben to each share a eulogy of their father.
Dad had a long life, so my talk will just really be about his years on the farm. Dad came from a farm labouring family who emigrated from England in 1849. By 1858, they had bought their own farm, and Dad was the fifth generation of the family to farm in South Australia. During World War II, he attended Balaclava High School, where at one point, when writing his ambitions, he wrote that he wanted to be Prime Minister. After passing leaving, he started his working life as a farmer. While farming was okay for Dad, he had wider interests. He took flying lessons, liked boats, and was always aware of current affairs. A highlight of his week was picking up the bulletin near the gate. It was his interest in politics that led Dad to join the Liberal and Country League, and it was at one of their meetings that he met and then married our mother, Anne Fletcher, a teacher who was brought up on a farm at Lewiston. They had 4 children, myself, Kathleen, Michael, who has sadly died, and Jane, known as Ellie. There was one defining thing about Dad. He was practical, and he really liked making things. He and Jim Cunningham, who worked with us, dug out a cellar and steps by hand and then concreted it. But what Dad liked most was making things out of steel. He loved welding and he was very good at it. He never moved the welder's amperage off maximum. When I asked him how he didn't burn through thin material, he replied he just adjusted how quickly he moved the welding rod. A red letter day for Dad was when Mum bought him a power hacksaw. Today, people would laugh at how slow it was, but it was a huge improvement on hand sawing. Now he could set the saw and get on with welding. As children, we were often put to good use, but the one that stands out is being the human clamp. It was our job to hold the other end of the tube he was welding and to be as still as we could. Among other things Dad made were, the long list here, mobile turkey runs, steel frames for stock shelters and sheds, cattle yards, roof racks, land rollers, including a 9-tonne single roller that is still in use, and tables, including one made from a bowling alley floor. He made a caravan which he used as a mobile electoral office, and eventually he made a clover harvester. Dad always wanted to grow and harvest clover, but his early homemade threshing contraption started a fire that had the whole neighbourhood out with their 44-gallon drums of water and backpack firefighters. He was convinced to give up the clover growing idea for the time being at least. However, he never really gave up that idea. In the late 70s, he started growing it again, and this time he had offspring labour to help harvesting. My sister Kathleen has supplied the following anecdote. Dad tried everything. Like all farmers, he had learned to do everything without help and often with improvised tools. Mum was in despair because either the kitchen knives had disappeared or they reappeared in the knife drawer with scrape marks and very sharp blades. We had a Horwood Bagshaw clover harvester, and Dad said they hadn't changed their design since the 1950s. The first thing all the farmers did when they bought a new harvester was to get out the oxyacetylene and cut a window in the chute so they'd be able to service it during harvest without losing too much time. So Dad decided he'd make his own clover harvester. He was pleased and excited until he realised it was underpowered. Reluctantly, he bought another second-hand engine for it to bolt on top of the existing one. But how do you do that? You get your daughter Kathy to stand ready with a spanner, then you heave up the top one with a crowbar and tell her to tighten the nuts underneath it while you tell her to hurry. So Dad had the most amazing, loudest, slowest clover harvester in the district that pounded and crashed its way around the paddock doing the cleanest sweep anyone had seen. He was really sad to stop using it. He said it was using too much fuel, but we thought it was because it looked like and sounded like it was going to fall apart. And I'll just add a note here. That machine had 46 grease nipples, and Dad christened it Squabble Guts. Whilst work was a big focus of our life with Dad, it was alleviated with humour and practical jokes. Dad's mother Stella made opal jewellery, and when each of her granddaughters turned 21, they received a special piece. When it came to Michael's 21st, Dad warned him in advance that Grandma had made him a set of opal cufflinks, and could he show the proper appreciation? Of course, Grandma had done nothing of the kind, and Dad was laughing when Michael opened the present and was surprised to not find cufflinks, but a parcel of shares. Dad also had forbearance. If you did something silly, you were a duffer. When I backed into his car in the dark and smashed both headlights, it was what he didn't say that was a measure of his forbearance. As mentioned before, Dad liked boats. He made a raft that was tied up on the Gawler River, and he had several boats in his time. My uncle, John Hall, here with us today, was Dad's only sibling, and he recounts the following story. Steele purchased an unfinished steel boat weighing a few tonne. The local carrier delivered it and left it on his semi-trailer at the farm. With me helping Steele, we erected scaffolding above the bow and stern using block and tackles. Steele made cables from multiple layers of fencing wire, as a farmer might do. The boat was raised and the semi-trailer driven away. We then started to use the block and tackles, which caused the wire cables to break and let the boat crash to the ground, but still upright. We were both somewhat shaken about, and as we climbed off the boat, Steele said, "Let's go inside and have a milkshake," not realising that I had a broken ankle. Dad always lamented there were not enough practical people in Parliament. So often ideas fail because of an overlooked practical detail. Dad was brought up with loving and stable parents, Sid and Steele Hall, which gave him confidence and resilience in life. Uncle John tells the following story. When our father died, land that had not been given was left equally to Steele and myself. One parcel of land near Balaclava was left to both of us. Whilst visiting our mother, Steele said, "I suppose you want this land, and so do I. What say we set a value on the land, toss a coin, and the winner pays the other out?" I tossed a coin and Steele won. Steele said, "I knew you would win," and thereafter there were no hard feelings. Dad was tough, both physically and mentally. He tried to imbue his children with that toughness. There was a time when we went swimming in the sea in winter before school. Excuse me. Camping did not include mattresses, we slept on the ground. And the idea of a hike did not include following a path. We had to battle through bush to the tops of mountains in the Grampians. It was Dad's toughness that allowed him to move on from disappointments, such as the 1970 election, and go on to live a good life with his blended family, including Joan, Alexia and Ben. We loved him and miss him. Thank you.
All right. When in doubt, just do it. A motto Steele Hall truly lived by throughout his long life of 95 years. Dad was never one to let an opportunity pass him by, and importantly, would never avoid the hard questions or conversations. He was a man of great integrity, who would always do the right thing and expected those around him to do the same. Whilst most of you know this side of him from his political life, he was far more than just a politician. No offence to those in this room. He was a family man, a father, a grandfather, and a great-grandfather. Sadly, our brother Michael passed away early last year. A farmer, an orator, a leader, an artist, an outback adventurer, an avid fisherman, and a humanist concerned for the welfare of his fellow man. Born to fourth-generation farmers Sid and Stella in Owen in November 1928, he completed his schooling in the local area and remained on the family farm for over a decade. As Mary spoke about before, Dad rather fancied himself a semi-professional engineer of farming machinery, often with some very questionable results. In 1956, he married Anne Fletcher, his first wife, with whom he went on to have 4 children. After entering the political arena in 1959, it was his charisma and intellect that saw him quickly excel into the leadership of the Liberal Country League. And he then went on to become the Premier in 1968. Dad would often tell me how the people in political life were a lot more robust and practical back then. Excitedly talking about when he went to the Pearson Islands with then Premier Tom Playford, sleeping on the deck of a 50-foot steel boat and going shark fishing on the way. Or when the party room getaway consisted of sleeping stretchers sprawled across a gym floor and lots of policy debate. Now, sorry, Rex has pinched my stuff on the Queen there, but to be fair, he probably said it better. We've heard some great stories about his achievements whilst he was in office. The Dartmouth Dam, fixing the gerrymander, and health and social reforms. However, there are some other examples that embody his cheeky nature. So, since World War II, it's been the sole purview of the federal government to levy an income tax. But when Dad met Prime Minister Gorton, at the end of the meeting in any other business, he asked how he might go about moving back to a system where it was the states that would levy an income tax. A thoroughly unimpressed Gorton replied, "Steele, that hasn't been done for decades." To which Dad replied, "I just thought I'd ask." He was always thinking ahead of his time. So although considered a hot button issue of today, it was actually way back in the late 60s when he wrote to the then Premier of Victoria asking if he was interested in going halves in a nuclear power station in the southeast. We all know how that turned out. Other achievements he was immensely proud of included being the last person to negotiate an increase in South Australian Murray-Darling water rights, the MATS plan, the Outer Harbour Terminal, establishing the Environmental Authority and establishing the intermediate courts, and of course approving the site and design of where we all are today, the Adelaide Festival Centre, the place where my wife and I had our wedding reception too. True to his nature of pushing the boundaries and never compromising on his principles, he went on to form and lead the Liberal movement. This saw him re-elected to the State Parliament and then the Senate. Dad was actually serving during the double dissolution election of 75, when government supply was blocked. When the Liberal movement merged with the Liberal Party in the late 70s, the rest, as they say, is history. In 1978, he married my mother Joan and went on to have 2 more children, myself and my sister Alexia, who was unable to be here today. I'd like to thank her for her extraordinary support to our mother since our dad passed 3 weeks ago. Growing up with 2 politicians for parents was interesting, to say the least. My sister and I thought it was completely normal to be playing hide and seek around Parliament House and to have a bunch of politicians as babysitters, some of whom are in this room. We thought nothing of it when Laurie Oakes was making toasties for our dinner, or when Diana Hill had to explain to Dad it might just be a little bit socially awkward to keep sending his small children to school with briefcases instead of backpacks. It was safe to say lullabies were replaced with question time in our house. Dad made some wonderful lifelong friends throughout his career in politics, both across the aisle and in the media, and also in the business community. After moving into the federal parliament in 1981, he remained at the forefront of national and South Australian politics, with a career spanning more than 30 years until he retired in 1996 and went back to farming. Even in his post-political life, Steele couldn't resist seeing how things could be done differently. Aside from continuing with the successful staple crops, he had a failed attempt at building a Christmas tree farming empire. Undeterred, he tried again. At one stage, we were the 2nd largest watermelon producers in South Australia. Now, that might sound impressive, but it's actually because it's not a good idea in South Australia. In the 2nd year, the entire crop was cooked on the vine in 3 days of 40-degree heat. Dad had a love of animals, nature, and the outdoors. He had a red Kelpie, Danny, who would never leave his side. His holidays of choice were camping trips into the desert and the most challenging places he could find. After he retired, every year he would venture into the outback by himself to see some new places. Trips included remote parts of the Territory and the Simpson Desert. He was an avid fisherman, with Coffin Bay, Port Parham and York Peninsula being some of his favourite haunts. However, it was spending time with his brother John, fishing for whiting, that he treasured the most. One of Dad's significant retirement projects was actually converting a 40-foot prawn trawler over the course of 2 years, but after taking it out just half a dozen times, decided it was far too big and promptly sold it. A little known fact about Dad is that he actually followed in his mother's footsteps as an artist. For as long as I can remember, he was always tinkering with and perfecting metal sculptures of Australian animals like kangaroos and galahs. In his late 70s, he started making opal jewellery and very much enjoyed travelling around the outback to find just the right stones for his pieces. It must be said that his love of metal sculptures and making things meant he was slowly but surely trying to replicate Bunnings in our backyard. At one stage, we had 7 sheds, all of which had carefully rehearsed justifications for when Mum noticed our ever-shrinking outdoor space. However, one of his most endearing characteristics was his complete and utter lack of interest in sport. At the end of a flight from Adelaide to Sydney, the passenger sitting next to him turned and said, "Thank you for letting me relax in peace on this flight." To which Dad said, "Of course," and then asked the flight staff who he was. They eagerly informed him he'd been sitting next to none other than world champion Formula One driver Ayrton Senna. Clearly, Dad didn't read the sports pages. Having said that, he was also a believer in the saying, "Happy wife, happy life." He agreed to attend one soccer match and one football game with Mum every year, but he drew the line at cricket. Dad remained a grounded and practical man in his post-political life, at times to the point of embarrassment. This was on full display one evening at Government House at a very loud event. The then Governor discreetly took my mother aside and asked if it was possible was Steele using bread as earplugs. Much to Mum's horror, Dad explained there were no more napkins and bread was the most malleable material available. Although no longer in Parliament, Dad was never far from the orbit of politics. He took a keen interest in mentoring the next generation of Liberal Party candidates over the last 3 decades. After being made a lifelong member of the Young Liberals, he was forever boasting he was also its oldest ever member. His morals and integrity were a big influence on all of his children. Among the 6 of us, our careers have varied from art to farming, writing, military service, government service, mining and corporate life. And Dad continued to be a constant positive influence and sounding board throughout all of our careers. As many of you would be aware, in his final years, Dad experienced the slow decline of dementia. This was a challenging time, but also one of unwavering support from his family, especially from my mother, Joan. We're all forever thankful to the Frome Wing at Helping Hand in North Adelaide, where he spent his final few years. When Steele passed away on the 10th of June, it was the end of a long and full life, one rich with experiences and adventure, filled with family and friends. He left behind a record of exemplary public service and achievements. He lived a life to be proud of, one with no regrets, and that's because, if in doubt, he just did it.
Thanks to Paris Netting and Michael Irache for that performance of the meditation from Thais by Massenet, and chosen to mark Steele's particular liking for the violin as an instrument. We at the Adelaide Festival Centre are honoured that Joan and the family would choose the Festival Theatre for this memorial service. And it is very fitting because Steele chose this important site for the Festival Centre and championed it fearlessly. And of course it was a joint effort, Steele's vision, which Don Dunstan then carried through. True bipartisanship to the lasting benefit of our community. A festival centre for Australia's best festival city. Steele knew that this site, which has brought people together for cultural events for thousands of years, was the right place to continue that legacy into the future. For where arts and culture flourish, so do understanding and tolerance. Today, the Adelaide Festival Centre is an anchor attraction in our greater Riverbank arts, entertainment, sports and education precinct, with lots more to come. So Steele's initial vision is alive and well and central to our reputation as a dynamic and lively city, and central to the well-being of our community. So we have much to be grateful for. Thank you, Steele Hall.
Thank you, Douglas. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the official proceedings for today. Thank you all for attending the memorial service as we celebrate the life, service and achievements of Mr. Steele Hall. I now invite everyone to proceed to the gallery area of the foyer to share refreshments. Thank you all very much. Thank you.